Hello TEI community. I'm very sorry I can't be with you today. You're a bit far away from me here in Oxford. But I'm very pleased to be able to read my paper to you, and I hope to participate in the discussion. What is TEI conformance and why should you care? I'll begin by asking a question we don't often ask. What are encoding standards actually for? What do we actually gain from adopting an explicit encoding standard? What scholarly advantage is there in formally defining the formats of our digital representations of cultural artifacts? We may be doing it simply in order to be seen to be ticking the right boxes in the funding agency's list of criteria. We may be doing it because our elders and betters have told us we should. We may be doing it because we don't know any better. But none of these can be considered well-founded motivations. How does the use of explicit standards in the markup of digital resources contribute to the success or failure of a scholarly enterprise using them? Firstly, I suggest we shouldn't forget that the application of markup is an inherently scholarly act. It expresses a scholarly interpretation. It is a hermeneutic activity. Our choice of markup vocabulary is therefore not an arbitrary one. It has consequences. It may make it harder to express a truth about a document or a document's intentions. It may make it easier to say something which is convenient but false. To dismiss as mere semantics concerns about the proper application of markup is therefore to embark upon a rather dangerous path. If, of course, you share my belief that every scholarly encoding should truthfully represent, without convenient distortion, a scholarly reading. Secondly, if the function of markup is to express an interpretation, then the markup language itself should, as far as possible, eschew ambiguity. Markup defines and determines the interface between algorithmic processing and human interpretations. Life is complicated enough without introducing additional fuzziness and inconsistency into that processing stack. We'd like to live in a world where two equally well-informed observers looking at the same encoding will reach similar or identical conclusions as to the interpretations or the motivation which occasioned that encoding. We would also like to be confident that two equally well-informed encoders, considering the same textual phenomenon and being similarly motivated, will encode that interpretation in the same way. This is not, of course, the same as wishing that all well-informed encoders should reach the same interpretive conclusions about the text, quite the contrary. Consequently, as far as possible, we expect the claims embodied by a marked-up document to be formally verifiable in some way. Verifiability implies the existence of some formal definition for the markup language, against which productions using it can be checked, preferably automatically. Talking solely of XML documents, we would prefer them to be not just well-formed, but also valid. Scholarly markup, however, requires more than simple XML validity. A marked-up document, for us, has intention beyond what an XML schema can express. A typical XML schema will allow me to say that the XML element P must appear within the XML element div and not the reverse, but it won't easily let me say that the content of my P element should correspond to a paragraph of text, rather than, say, a page or a potato. For that information, I will need to consult project-specific documentation, which should spell out exactly the intentions behind this set of encoded documents. Thirdly, therefore, we need to complement the automatic validation of our markup with semantic controls, and these, in our present state of knowledge, are not automatable. They require human judgment. It is, I think, no coincidence that SGML, the ancestor of XML, was produced by a lawyer. The rules embodied by an SGML DTD, like those in the statute book, must be interpreted to be used. In the field of the law, the statute book is completed by precedents. In the case of an XML schema used by a broad community such as the TEI, the rules incarnated in the TEI guidelines must be completed by the practice of those using them. whether we're thinking about the guidelines as a whole or the customizations of them used by individual projects. It's a TEI customization which expresses how a given project has interpreted the general principles enumerated in the guidelines, as well as formally specifying which particular components of the guidelines have been used. It also provides ample opportunity through documentation and exemplification to guide human judgment as to the way in which that markup should be understood, and therefore the extent to which different datasets using it can be integrated or rendered interoperable, a point to which I will return at the end of this. How are encoding standards to be documented? As a minimum, the documentation of an encoding standard has to be able to specify the same things as an XML schema or a LaxNG schema or a DTD. The names of the elements and attributes used, their possible attributes, how those elements can be validly combined, and so on. The schema languages currently available to us don't provide an entirely identical range of facilities of this kind, nor indeed do they can think of validation of documents in exactly the same way. But they are in sufficiently broad agreement for it to be possible to model the information they require using a single XML vocabulary, and that vocabulary now forms a part of ODD, the TEI tagset documentation system. Of course, if schema models were all that ODD supported, it would be hard to persuade anybody to use it in preference to them. But the full-OD language, of course, provides for much more than the basic information required to create a schema model, as I think it's safe to assume that my present audience is well aware. A TEI customization is made by selecting from the available specifications. To facilitate that task, the specifications are grouped together, both physically into named modules and logically into named classes. Each module contains a number of related declarations, and modules can be combined as necessary, though in practice there are one or two modules providing components which are needed in almost any encoding. A class, by contrast, is an abstract object to which elements point in order to express their semantic or structural status. Now, a customization which just specifies a bunch of modules will overgenerate, not only in the sense that the resulting schema will contain specifications for components that will never be used, but also because of the fact that the TEI often provides multiple ways of encoding essentially the same phenomenon. The TEI core module provides both Bibble and BibbleStruct as ways of representing a bibliographic record. The same module provides a handful of elements for signaling the function associated with visual distinctions such as highlighting or quote marks, etc., but also provides a way of simply signaling the presence of such visual salience or highlighting. The TEI is scrupulously agnostic, even about how a TEI document itself is to be constructed. The classic TEI document comprises a TEI header and a transcribed text, but that transcribed text may be combined with a set of digitized images or even replaced by such a set. It is even possible to replace or complement the traditional text transcription, aiming to capture the logical organization of the source document, with a source-oriented transcription, which captures just its physical organization and eschews other interpretive gestures. And I understand there are plans to add a further text-level component to contain standoff annotations. This multiplicity of choice can be bewildering and may seem absurd, yet every element and every attribute in the TEI guidelines is there because some member of the scholarly community has plausibly argued that it is essential to their needs. Where there is a choice, therefore, it is not because the TEI is indecisive. It is because all of the available options have been considered necessary by someone, even if no one, except perhaps those blessed with the task of maintaining the TEI, ever considers all of them together. A project wishing to use the TEI is therefore obliged to consider carefully how to use it. Just selecting a few promising modules is not necessarily the best approach. You will also need to select from the components provided by those modules, since selecting everything available is a recipe for confusion. and those unwilling or inadequately resourced to make this effort can use one or other of the generic customizations made available by the TEI itself, TEI Simple Print for example, or made available by specific research communities. Epidoc is an excellent example. But, I contend, adopting an off-the-peg encoding system is always going to be less satisfactory than customizing it to fit more precisely the actual needs of your project, the actual data you have modelled within it. You did do a data analysis before you started, didn't you? And whether or not you did, it's painfully true that nothing in digital form is ever really finished. It's almost inevitable that as your project evolves, you will come across things you would do differently if you could start all over again. In the light of experience, you will want to change the list of available elements to match more closely your actual encoding practices. Beginners often think that it's better to allow for almost any kind of content, and an extreme case of this misapprehension leads people to use TEI all for everything. It may well be that your project started out a bit uncertain about the kind of data it should be able to handle, but as it matured, those uncertainties will have disappeared, and your project-specific practice will be better understood. The cost-benefit ratio of allowing for the unforeseen begins to change. Every element you allow for in your schema is a cost. It is another element you need to explain to your encoders, another element you need to document and find examples for, and another element whose usage you will need to check for consistency. It's also another element that the poor, overworked software developer has to be prepared to handle. Similar considerations obviously apply to attributes, in particular to their range of values. At the outset, you may not have been sure what values to permit for the foo attribute on your bar elements, so you allowed for anything. Now you discover that some of your encoders gave this attribute the value center, others used centered, and yet others use middle, and they all mean, probably, the same thing. Now that you know which values you want, you should add a val list to your customization to enforce this, even if it entails, perhaps, some additional work cleaning up existing data. Customization is typically a simple matter of selection, formally speaking, a subsetting operation. A customization which specifies that attribute values be taken from a closed list of possible values, rather than being any token of an appropriate data type, is a subsetting operation, because the set of documents considered valid by that customization is a pure subset of the set of documents considered valid by a schema which lacks that customization. This may or may not be true of a modification which changes the data type of an attribute. For example, changing from string to date is a subsetting operation, whereas the reverse, from date to string, is not. It's perfectly easy to think of apparently benign and useful modifications which inevitably do not result in a subset. For example, a modification might provide alternate identifiers for all existing elements and attributes, perhaps to translate the canonical English names into another language. A modification might change the class memberships of an existing element so that it acquired attributes not previously available, or so that it might appear in contexts where it previously could not. A modification may change the content model of an element to permit different child elements, or it may change it so that existing child elements can appear in a different order or with different cardinalities. And of course a modification can readily define entirely new elements, macros and so on, or reference them from existing TEI components. The TEI provides a completely unmodified schema called TEI all, which contains all the elements, classes and so on defined by the TEI. For all practical purposes, though, a user of the TEI makes a selection from this, and I will call that a customization. Of course, there are many possible TEI customizations, each involving different choices, but there are at least two different kinds of customization, a TEI subset and a TEI extension. When a set of modifications results in a schema which regards as valid a subset of the documents considered valid by TEI all, I will call this a TEI subset. Where this is not the case, I will use the term TEI extension. A customization which adds new elements or attributes, or one in which elements are systematically renamed, must result in an extension, because the set of documents that the schema generated from it will consider valid cannot be a proper subset of the documents regarded as valid by the TEI all schema. However, a change to the content model or the class memberships of existing TEI elements may or may not result in a TEI subset. For example, suppose that TEI all does not specify an order for the child elements of some content model. A customization which does constrain that order will be a TEI subset, but the reverse is not the case. If TEI all does specify an order, a customization which relaxes that constraint will consider valid some documents considered invalid by TEI all, and it is therefore a TEI extension. When TEI extensions which include TEI elements or attributes whose properties or semantics have been significantly changed, should place those elements or attributes in a different namespace. On the face of it, this means that any element containing such a redefined element will have a different content model and should therefore be in a different namespace as well. And the same ought to apply to its parent models, its parent elements, and so on up the TEI hierarchy to the TEI root itself. Fortunately, there is a nuance of detail which means we don't need to invoke this turtles all the way up scenario. TEI content models are defined not in terms of specific elements, but in terms of references to model classes. A class reference will be dereferenced to a special set of elements, to a specific set of elements, only when a node is converted to a schema. And this is necessary because the set in question will depend on which elements are available in the customization. Any element, including one from a non-TEI namespace, may claim membership in a TEI model class, and hence legitimately appear in the content of a TEI element referencing that class without affecting it. Having used the word legitimate, I should probably move on to talk about the main question posed by this paper. What is TEI conformance? Umberto Eco remarks somewhere that a novel is a machine for generating interpretations. So we might say that the TEI is a machine for generating schemas to formally represent such interpretations. However, just as not all interpretations of a novel have equivalent explanatory force, so not all TEI customizations are of equal effectiveness or appropriateness. A customization documents a view of what it is meaningful to assert about a set of documents, specifically with reference to the existing set of concepts distinguished by the TEI. It does this by selecting the particular distinctions it wishes to make, possibly modifying some of them, possibly adding to them. I suggest that our assessment of the appropriateness of a given customization, its conformance, if you will, should take into account the way in which that customization is expressed. Of course, there are good pragmatic grounds as well for wanting to know how a given customization has modified the TEI definitions. It enables us to make comparisons amongst different customizations and to assess their relative closeness to the original guidelines and to determine what might be necessary to make documents using these different customizations interchangeable, if not interoperable. As Martin Holmes and others have pointed out, the pursuit of unmediated interoperability amongst TEI documents is largely chimerical, whereas the information provided by a TEI customization will often be all that is needed to make them interchangeable. The notion of TEI conformance is introduced in Chapter 23 of the TEI Guidelines, but sadly that chapter at present falls short of providing a consistent formal definition either of what conformance means or of how it should be assessed. One motivation for this paper, in fact, is to start a discussion on how best to rectify that. I would like to conclude by suggesting that TEI conformance is more than a matter of validity against a schema. However, it shouldn't be forgotten that there are still a few hardwired rules built into the TEI model, which the customizer ignores at their peril, or rather at the peril of their potential audience. For example, a TEI header really must have a title statement containing at least one title, along with a publication statement and a source description, even if none of these have any significant content. A TEI text element really must contain a body element. TEI div elements really must nest correctly within one another. The structural classes in terms of which content models are defined really must be respected. Hence, one P cannot contain another, and a phrase level element such as hi cannot contain a block element such as P. Some of these restrictions, as we all know, are subject of regular debate on TEIL and elsewhere. But for the most part, in my view at least, they are integral parts of the TEI model. It's part of the definition of a TEI div, that once you've encountered another nested div within it, only div elements at the same hierarchic level are permitted until it finishes. This is not to say that a non-tessellating division element might not be useful, but if one were defined, it must be distinguished clearly from the existing TEI div. For example, it might be placed in a different namespace or have a different name. Breaking these rules can have unexpected consequences. For example, a customization which simply removes the element title will result in a schema in which no TEI header element can ever be considered valid, since the mandatory components of the TEI header are an essential part of it. A TEI header which lacks them is a different object, a different kind of object, and shouldn't present itself as being something which it isn't. In assessing conformance, there is a natural tendency to attach particular importance to validity against a schema. This is something which can be automatically tested, after all. However, in the case of a TEI extension, it is unreasonable to require that valid documents should also be valid against TEI all. Validation of a document which uses a TEI extension can only properly be performed by a schema generated from the OD defining that extension, and it may additionally require the use of a namespace-aware validator, such as ONVDL, for example. And this is one reason why validity against TEI all has limited significance in assessing the stages of a customization. All that it can do is tell us whether this is a TEI subset or a TEI extension. But the TEI was designed to facilitate either kind of customization, and so either should be considered equally conformant, if by conformant we mean coherent with the design goals or the recommendations of the TEI. I believe that the ability to extend the range of encodings supported by the TEI in a simple and straightforward manner is a fundamental requirement for a system which is intended to serve the needs of research. This requirement has several important benefits. It enables the TEI to integrate with comparative ease other specialized XML vocabularies, such as MathML, SVG, or most recently MEI. It facilitates and encourages the development of new TEI components by the broader community. It simplifies the task of interchange by reducing the possibility of ambiguous or incoherent encoding. This polytheoricity is what underlies the TEI's apparent complexity, and it is also a major motivation for the requirement that a modification should use namespaces in a coherent manner. In particular, that elements not defined by the TEI, or TEI elements whose definition has been modified to such an extent that they arguably no longer represent the same concept, should not be defined within the TEI namespace. Yes, of course, reasonable people may reasonably disagree about whether two concepts are semantically different, just as they may disagree about how to define either concept in the first place. And that is part of what Darrell Raymond memorably called the hellfire of ontology, into which the descriptive markup project has plunged an entire generation. but I don't think it invalidates the general principle that TEI conformance entails a respect for the consensus, just as much as it facilitates autonomy. Even in the case of a customization which has eschewed extension and appears to be a straightforward TEI subset, an assessment of TEI conformance necessarily involves attention to some constraints which are not formally verifiable. In particular, I suggest there are two important, if largely unenforceable, requirements of honesty and explicitness. By honesty, I mean that elements in the TEI namespace must respect the semantics which the TEI guidelines supply as part of their definition. For example, the TEI defines an element L as containing a single, possibly incomplete, line of verse. If your encoding is going to distinguish verse and prose, it would be dishonest to use this element to mark line breaks in prose. Secondly, by explicitness, I mean that all modifications should be properly documented, preferably by means of an OD, specifying exactly how the TEI declarations on which they're based have been derived. An OD need not, of course, be based on the TEI at all, but in that case the questions of TEI conformance doesn't arise. The OD language is rich in documentary components, not all of which are automatically processable, but it is usually much easier to determine how the markup of a set of documents should be interpreted or processed from an OD than it is from the many pages of human-readable documentation which would be needed to explain everything about an idiosyncratic encoding scheme. So, let me give my conclusion, my definition, my provisional definition of what it is that we are saying if we say that a document is TEI conformant. Firstly, it is currently a well-formed XML document, and it is valid against one or more schemas. These may be either a TEI subset or a TEI extension, and its usage of elements in the TEI namespace is compatible with the intended function of those elements as defined by the TEI, and its usage of the TEI markup scheme is fully described by a TEI conformant OD or analogous documentation. Let me conclude by stressing that the purpose of these rules is to make interchange of documents easier. Observing these rules does not guarantee that, and they certainly do not provide any guarantee of interoperability. But they make much simpler, for example, the kind of scenario in which a richly encoded, highly personalized TEI encoding can be simply down-translated to other, perhaps less expressive, but more standardized encodings for purposes of interchange. As more and more independent agencies undertake mass digitization and encoding projects, the risk of a new confusion of tongues, the threatened Tower of Babel which the TEI was specifically created to resist, has not retreated. A definition of conformance which relies on an enforced lowest common denominator, Dublin Core springs to mind, makes it hard to benefit from truly sophisticated and scholarly standards. One which promotes permissiveness and extensibility, as the TEI does, has to balance the sophistication of what it makes feasible with a clear and accessible definition of its markup. Unlike many other standards, the goal of the TEI standard is not to enforce consistency of encoding, but to provide a means by which encoding choices, encoding policy, can be more readily understood and hence more easily made algorithmically comparable. Thank you.